Thank you, everyone, for joining us on Now Next Later for Monday, May 12th. It's great to have Sasha, you here with us today, and our guest, Taylor Stork. So thank you, Sasha, for being here. And Taylor, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Well, we have this momentary uh, point in the show where the waiting room comes over and joins us. I always remind everyone who attends, thank you for joining us live. This is then reposted on YouTube afterwards, but if you're here live, you get to ask questions. We monitor the chat. We use the Q&A. So if you have a question for Taylor, please, I'll keep an eye on it and we'll put that question in front of him by the end of the show. And
If
just a
I have a
quick,
tailored question, can I ask questions? If
yes,
I
you
type
can.
into the chat, can I ask myself a question?
The only thing we ask is that you refrain from third person. So as long as you
Okay.
say, I want to ask myself a question, then we're game on. How's that?
So, like, what if I use thou and pronouns like that? Okay.
Exactly. Listen, everything about innovation that's old is new again, and
Okay.
vice versa. So bringing back that language, we're here for it. That's what we
Okay.
do now next later.
Absolutely. Great.
So thank you for being here. What we thought we would do today, um, tried to give Taylor at least 30 seconds of a head start on these topics. That's how we like to do it. It's a hot seat, but you get 30 seconds heads up. We thought what we would do is highlight some of the issues that you took to Washington in
Mhm.
the CHLA fly-in, and what we focus on here is a lot around mortgage lender data technology and regulation. So
Okay.
sounds like some of the topics have a big overlap in that technology space, in the vendor space, for specifically community lenders, IMBs, local banks and credit unions. So I'm curious if we could start. Sasha kicked us off on a text chain with a couple of different options and topics. So credit Sasha on this, not me. But I'm going to kind of start us off with some of what you heard. And it seems like of the three issues that I saw, that we're going to talk a lot about regulation of data and technology. And then we'll talk about some product specific or technology specific issues. And so it sounded to me, Taylor, like you maybe could give us just kind of a high level of the state of affairs, but then also specifically jump in with our first now topic of credit scores. So tell us, like, how was CHLA fly-in, and what's the state of affairs? And then we'll jump into that first substantive topic straight away.
So it's really interesting because the our CHL fly-in was originally going to be held a month sooner, a month earlier, a little bit more than a month earlier, and we postponed it. And part of the reason we postponed it was because people didn't have jobs yet. The administration is new. It's new again, and the appointees, many of them have not been appointed, let alone confirmed. And then even once they are confirmed, there's still a process to go through the next level down, next level down, next level down positioning. And
Mhm.
so we were in a meeting and somebody made a joke that many of the people that we're meeting with haven't even figured out where their offices yet or where to get coffee because it is so new. The mini staff and the mini appointees. It's not that they're new to the roles of the industry. It's just that they might not know where their desk is yet, or still be getting acquainted with the building that they're new to, and
Yep.
that is a theme that I think carries over into many different areas of policy. So when you take a look at what is happening and what has happened, and kind of what I'll call the first 100 days of this administration relative to mortgage, they are rapidly unwinding policies of old in
Mhm.
order to make way for policies of new. And so right now, and play along with the now next later theme. Right now, they are doing what I'm going to refer to as policy spring cleaning. And the CFPB is probably the best place to start and the perfect example
Okay.
because first, they issued a bunch of internal memos saying we're going to change our focus to this. Next, they said we don't need 1,500 people if we're not going to be aggressively pursuing all of these things that we no longer are going to focus on them on. And so they released a large amount of those 1,500 people. And then those that are remaining and still there issued a number of reversals on policies as recently as last week. And so we are seeing policy after policy after policy. In fact, I've got a list of like 20 or 30 policies that just got reversed. And now we, the mortgage industry, have to react to that, right? So we have to go figure out, okay, what is it that I now need to change that I built everything up around for that I can now reverse? I got to unwind a workflow. I got to unwind a process. I got to unwind a thought process in order to comply with the state of affairs as it is right this minute. That's the kind of the next space. And then the later is eventually we'll start to see new initiatives coming in, new policies coming out. And some of those new policies from the administration revolve around things like GSE exit. Other policies revolve around simply getting, for instance, the GSEs to operate more like businesses and less like government agencies. So there's all these things, but in order to clear the deck so that you can make the changes you want to make if you're a new administration, you kind of have to clear the deck first. And I think we're kind of in the clearing the deck space right this second. So that was probably the most profound thing that I observed. I did not get the sense that the decision makers and leaders are simply only trying to unwind. I got the sense that they are unwinding with purpose in order to implement new things that are good for us. So,
Okay. And so,
Yeah, and Jer, I know you wanted to hop into credit first, but I'm going to throw a curveball just because it fits in really nicely. I was present, as were a couple of others from our company, and it was really interesting to meet with, as always, all the different organizations and agencies. But the one meeting that really resonated with me, and Taylor, I'd love for you to elaborate on and make sure that you capture the essence of it correctly compared to me, was with Mark Calabria. And the thought process that he shared around wanting to create sustainable change rather than this, constant pendulum going back and forth as administration shift. And then the lenders are feeling the pendulum swing, one way, maybe every 4 years, 8 years, unless somebody changes something at worst. But nevertheless, that whiplash reaction is just so challenging. And so I felt this sentiment from him that was very strong in, there are areas where it's really duplicative or unnecessary, especially for IMBs, for the CFPB to be regulating where states are already meeting the spirit of. And so, in addition to your point around clearing the deck and planning and preparing for what's next, I heard this theme around how can we look at putting something in place that sustains beyond just the next 4 years to ensure that we don't have regulation just for the sake of regulation, that we're actually more intentional around how we manage that. Did I capture that correctly? And how else would you describe, what you heard in the room and how you see the potential future there?
Yeah, no, you captured it very well. So we talked a lot about the fact that IMBs have to plan, and all lenders, to be candid with you, banks, whoever, all businesses have to plan out further than 3 or 4 years. And I made the point in the room that just because some policies are being reversed or unwound right now doesn't mean, or unenforced right now, doesn't mean that any business, lender, IMB, bank, other, doesn't mean that any of us can simply ignore the rules and the laws because we all have records, and 5 years from now, we might get examined on what happened in 2025 by a new administration. And so we talked about the fact that it's very easy to issue a proclamation and send a memo and say, we're no longer doing this. But that is only as good as the piece of paper that it's written on. The formal process of rulemaking is much stickier and longer lasting, but even rulemaking is not permanent because rulemaking can be unwound through future rulemaking. And there are devices to unwind rulemaking, and rulemaking can also be subject to judicial review and other review that may not stand the test of time. And the administration, as said by Mark Calabria, the administration is very focused on ensuring that the changes are the kinds of changes that will enable business to grow, that will increase the opportunity for home ownership by reducing the regulatory burden that ultimately gets passed through to the consumers and many times unnecessarily. And that in order to do that and ensure that it's sustainable and reliable, not just for the next 15 minutes, but for the next several years, and then can sustain an administrative change, ultimately, a lot of that needs to be codified into legislature. And CHLA, we are working on a couple of different items to help in that endeavor to try to codify some of these changes into legislature. In some cases, the legislature already exists and just needs to be re-examined, reinterpreted, and maybe amended in some short form. One of those has to do with how IMBs are regulated based on size and scope. So there's a number of those things, but ultimately the tone was not just change for the sake of change, but lasting change, because the businesses need to be able to count on that change and build their business models that will go on longer than the next 2, 3, 4 years.
I'll pick up on that because that's going to run through all the substantive issues we talk about. And I'm curious, when I think about that regulatory burden, there's two key pieces that we hear a lot from from lenders or members of the technology vendor community. One is cost and one is confusing or sort of like not clear. Can you talk a little bit about what you heard or what you would expect and what you're asking for in terms of this is just going to make things more clear? We hope that also is more efficient and cost effective, but it's clarity first. Or is it these regulatory burdens are really costing industry and costing the homeowner? So that's our primary concern. And we're going to use that as our driving force. How'd you hear about that?
Well, and I want to add a third to your list, which is consumer harm, right? So let's talk about consumer harm because ultimately it all feeds into that. The purpose of the CFPB, and I feel like we've become CFPB specific on this call, right? But ultimately, the purpose of the CFPB was to protect consumers. That's literally the name of the agency, protect consumers. And one of the eye-opening things is that the new administration did a significant amount of analysis of the proposed changes in place, the changes by fiat that were put into place, as well as a number of, probably all, I will be willing to get, the actions against lenders. And they literally said, show us the consumer that was harmed. Give me a borrower that didn't get a mortgage because of this thing over here that we cited a mortgage company for. Show me a group of borrowers that paid extra because of this other thing that we cited a mortgage company for. Show me a borrower that had to go file lawsuits against the company. And what they found was amongst, and I'm going to speak out of turn here, and I don't intend to, and I don't mean to paraphrase, but what they found was that amongst many, arguably most, perhaps all, amongst many of the actions that were taken against lenders specifically, they couldn't identify actual borrowers that were harmed. And the purpose of the Bureau is to protect borrowers. It's not to protect status quo. It's not to protect a set of laws that people feel good about. It is the Consumer Protection Bureau. They're supposed to protect consumers. And if you're going to protect consumers, you should be able to name the consumer that you protected. They can't. And that became this really eye-opening statement that, I'll be honest with you, when I sat in the room and I heard that, my eyes just popped out of my head. And so if you can't identify specific borrowers that were harmed as a result of a practice, then you start to look at, okay, how much cost are we adding into the process? How much burden are we creating in the system? And how much of that is inadvertently harming the consumers, right? Because if an IMB, and I like to use the phrase dancing through the raindrops, because when you're an IMB, you're a state licensed organization, which means you have at least one state regulator. And most of us have more than one. I think I've got like 20. And then maybe you have FHA, and then maybe you have, kind of shadow regulators like Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, Ginnie Mae. Perhaps you also remember that the CFPB regulates you, and the CFPB regulates every single IMB. There's no threshold. Banks, there's a threshold. There are nearly 5,000 banks that the CFPB does not regulate. Almost 5,000, 4,997, I think. But the Federal Bureau, right? However, the state agency, the state license agency, every single one of them is regulated by the CFPB. So when you start to look at that threshold, IMBs are really left trying to dance through the raindrops and not get wet. And we operate in a business that is a zero defect business. I don't get to make a mistake. One single mistake on a mortgage means I'm repurchasing a mortgage. And so we operate in a zero defect environment. In order to operate a business that runs in a zero defect environment and complies with multiple different regulators' requirements, which sometimes conflict with one another, by the way, in order to do that, you're dancing through the raindrops trying not to get wet. It's an impossible, I mean, it really is an impossible endeavor. And in order to dance through the raindrops without getting wet, it means you don't go out in the rain sometimes. And when you don't go out in the rain, that costs consumers money. It means they don't get an opportunity to get a mortgage from us, or it means that we don't do things that we should be doing to support the consumers, or it means that we're passing on a tremendous amount of expense in order to be perfect to the consumers, because ultimately all those expenses are passed through on the rate sheet or through fees. I think this administration is figuring it out, and that's the harm. The harm is the cost that's being passed on to borrowers.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to say it. I ended last episode of Now Next Later by saying, can we please stop promising we're going to lower the cost of origination? Because we're not. And I think you just made that argument. And I think we will in spots, and I think we should keep trying to. But we spend a lot of time over the last 5 years talking about how it keeps going up. Okay. So let's just admit it. It keeps going up for all the reasons you just ticked off. You said, this is the environment. And if that's true, then what's next? And I really like that framing of it to say that means we either double down on partnerships and innovation, we double down on advocacy and support for removing those barriers and actually measuring how it gets passed on, or we're not going to be able to lower the cost. And then regulators just have to deal with that. And the market just has to deal with that. And I think that kind of balance, and like you said, seamlessly moving between those three realities as you manage your business is a pretty good indicator of what it's like to run an IMB these days.
Hey, Jeremy, don't be mad, but I just got off stage talking about how to reduce loan costs.
I'm not, no, that's what I said. I think it's worth that investigation. It's just, isn't it interesting
your point.
Time we spend on it when, for all the reasons Taylor mentioned, some of it's just out of our control. No matter.
And it's insidious. I mean, it is insidious. In order to even identify the expenses, they are buried inside of third-party expenses. They're buried inside of workflows. They're buried inside of processes. There's no like line item for extra expense. It is, I hate to use this phrase, but it's fat inside of the meat on the bone. And it's really difficult to identify and say how much fat there is on inside of the meat on the bone. And there's a lot.
Yeah, there you go. So I think that's a perfect segue, because one of the things that, Sasha and I have been talking about is while there are a lot of similarities between how companies do business, their process, their focus, and the partners or vendors that they use, there's also a lot that's not the same. Yeah. And so let's talk a little bit about that, because when you think about moving these things around in the process, whether because regulatory freedom allows you to think about it that way, or technology comes in and says, hey, you know what, you can move this up funnel and do this here, do this here. And I know Sasha talks a lot about that on this show as well. So one of those areas is verification. And so we've spent a lot of time on Now Next Later on some form of data verification, technology verification. And I really liked credit scores, although feel free to not use that as the example, but I really like that as the example simply because there's a lot of regulation in that area as well. How you get consumer data, how you protect consumer data, what you do with consumer data when, and then credit scores tend to be sort of the tip of the spear in many ways, with kind of income and asset and employment following. Is that how your members see it? Is that how your company sees it? And then what was sort of the conversation about how we should think in this changing environment? Is consumer data regulation changing? And what are we talking about in that space? What's happening in
Huge question. Big question. By the way, I could go like maybe 5 or 10 different ways with this question. So credit scores, I think that's a great place to focus, if that's okay. The interesting thing about credit scores, the FICO score was created in like 1986. And prior to the FICO score, we didn't have consistent marketplaces. We just really didn't. There was, without a unifying scoring system, some sort of unifying metric, it was difficult to even have a robust secondary market for mortgages in the first place. Certainly difficult to build out a market for MSRs. Our market today is much more fluid because we have scoring models and scoring systems. And so I applaud the existence of the score in 1986 by Mr. Isaac and Mr. Fair. By the way, that's what Fair Isaac actually is. It's not because it's a fair score. It's the guy's last name was Fair.
Yeah.
And it was critical back then. And what it did at the time was it enabled borrowers to be considered not based on how they present physically, and the characteristics in their loan, but by a universal, unified metric that has no consideration theoretically for race, gender, socioeconomic status, all that kind of stuff. Now, in retrospect, have we learned that it's not exactly perfect? Sure, of course we have. I think that the big concern more recently is that in recent years, we've seen 600-800% price increases over a period of time where we've seen inflationary increases of only 20 or 30%. And those price increases continue and are sheltered by the fact that the scoring system that exists is functionally a monopoly guaranteed by the United States government, by virtue of the fact that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are in conservatorship and controlled by the United States government. In fact, their chairman was appointed by the president, right? For both of them.
Right.
The scoring issue. So a couple of years ago, there was a bunch of noise that we were going to add new scoring to the system, that we were going to add a new model entirely, that we were going to have options. We were going to transition from an old version to a new version of FICO. We were going to go from 3 bureaus down to 2 bureaus. I will tell you that based on the conversations I've heard, all of that stuff is, I'm just going to use the word, put on hold and delayed for the purpose of this conversation.
Yep.
I asked a lot of questions, and one thing I can tell you is that the logistical plumbing to even support a dual score system does not exist in either agency. It's not programmed, and we know that it would take a year to build it. And so there's your starting point. We're at least a year away if they wanted to do something.
If they even said yes, right.
If they even said yes to a bi-merge, tri-merge model, or to a Vantage V versus FICO model. And the previous administration wanted to do both, not either or. So it really doesn't save anybody any money. There's a lot of controversy around credit scores. And, in many cities, once upon a time, you could go to jail if you spit on the sidewalk. Right? There are still laws in the books in Wyoming that say that if you spit on the sidewalk, you go to jail. If you throw out gum and don't throw in the garbage, you can go to jail. Now, those laws were necessary at the time for a reason. Are they necessary today? Probably not. The laws in the Fair Credit Reporting Act in 1970 were really important. But does the structure of how we make mortgages today still require a FICO score? And let me say it differently, is that the only mechanism through which to navigate how to make robust, consistent credit decisions? I think that's a big question mark. And I think that's a next later kind of topic.
Yeah, I do too. I am so fired up by that. Go ahead, Sasha. I don't want to take over.
Say one of the areas that there were actually a couple, but one that I think is very hot topic and top of mind for people is whether or not medical and student loan debt will start to play into. We can sit here all day and debate, probably not because we have 5 minutes, whether or not leveraging a credit score really tells you if a borrower has the ability and willingness to repay. And I think we have a lot of opinions on that. But for the moment, it is the structure we have. It is the structure we use. And within that, there is some fear right now around that student and medical debt. Do you have any reflections there from the conversations, Taylor?
Yeah, I think any model that didn't already account for that is probably not a super accurate model. I mean, think about it, right? So we've all known they had student loans, and all of a sudden, all these loans, we've got 5 million student loans that are going to go into default. That's the number, give or take. And unless they start magically paying, and there's more like 10 million at risk. We're anticipating between that and then the medical debt that's being added back in, we're anticipating to see scores go down for a whole lot of people. And then that's going to say, okay, well, does that mean that the scores were ever right? Because the debt's always been there. It's a big question. It's a big question mark if you think about it. And theoretically, those scores should have modeled for all that debt one way or the other. Big question marks. There's a lot of big question marks.
There's a longer term impact too around the default that you mentioned, right? And how that impacts current portfolio, how that impacts a first-time home buyer's ability to even go get a loan if they haven't yet. Are they going to be going back to their parents' couch? Like I worry a lot in general about the impact to our industry with that coming as well, not just from a credit standpoint, but also just from an ability to put people in homes.
We did. Listen, this industry has made a lot of mortgages over the last couple of years for first-time home buyers that had student loans and didn't count the student loans into the DTI, right? Mm-hmm. Reality. And many of those student loans that didn't get counted into the DTI did not get paid because they were on forbearance. And in a month-ish, those loans will no longer be in forbearance, and the money will just be auto-deducted from people's paychecks. They are going to do wage garnishments. It's not a question of whether or not you're going to pay. You're going to pay. And so when wages are garnished and tax refunds are collected, because the tax refund you thought you were going to get, the big, huge tax refund, that's getting pulled. When all of a sudden your wages go down by the amount of your student loan repayment, which could be $1,000, $2,000, that money is just not there to pay other bills, fundamentally. And you cannot default on a student loan. You can't declare bankruptcy and wipe it out. They don't go away. There's a lot of borrowers that we're going to be looking at that fall into that swath, and they are squarely in that, COVID pandemic, 2021, 22, 23, first-time home buyer swath. And candidly, not just the students themselves, but sometimes the parents that co-signed.
Yeah, for sure. And I think like one of the things that make this such a complex industry are examples like this. We're talking about one slice, and what we're saying is, we have better data and technology today than we had when these choices were made of which model to use, and right. B, when rules were written about them. But we struggle to update both the framework and the technology around it. And also we have other issues that I would call external to our industry that fundamentally affect our risk, that are choices being made around economic stimulus or not, and who has spending power or not, right? And so I really wonder where this is going just from an economic stimulus perspective, because it's become a political issue, right? That's really what we're talking about. One administration said we should forgive some of this. The other administration said, not only are we not going to forgive it, we're going to go the other way and make sure that we garnish your wages to balance out the forgiveness, right? But either way, however you deal with it policy-wise, you have a dollars and cents issue for a bunch of people who are otherwise consumers in the U.S. economy that we need to talk about. So, and to Sasha's point, we need to service that on the side of our business all day, every day. And so that's where these things crash together in both advocacy, technology, and our management of our businesses. I think it's—
And I want to make one more point that people often forget. And if you're not a credit person, you might not even realize this. If you're in the mortgage business, a conventional loan is not decisioned based on a credit score.
That's right.
So for those of you that are not underwriters and aren't familiar with how AUS systems work, the Fannie Mae DU, the Freddie Mac LPA, they look at the credit score purely to decide whether or not the loan is eligible to be pooled. So you have to have the 620, that's the threshold eligibility. But once you're over 620, DU does not evaluate the credit score. And with FHA, we all know that we have significantly more flexibility around credit scores. The overwhelming purpose of a credit score really is to determine what the MSR values are going to be, and then pricing, right? Yeah. It's clearly to price risk, but what's the risk? what is the risk? Because we're going to do everything over 620, right? So more or less. It's a really interesting debate. And again, we needed the scores in 1986. Do we have better systems today to evaluate risk? Do we have better algorithms? Is AI going to come in and change everything? And I think it is, because that's what credit scores were 30 or 40 years ago. They were algorithms because we didn't have AI. Well, there's better algorithms coming out called artificial intelligence.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. I think the idea that we might be off on the resiliency of a customer. So to Sasha's point earlier about willingness and ability, and the fact that we might be off, it always brings me back, and I know this is kind of a cliche, but kind of always brings me back to Moneyball, where there was a whole generation of people who were used to just watching baseball players and writing down what they saw. And then all of a sudden somebody's like, we could figure out what the numbers are around hits and runs scored and use a different framework to measure whether we have different outcomes.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that the one doesn't necessarily work. It may work 90% of the time, 85% of the time, 80%, 80-20 rule, right?
Yeah, sure.
But we also could be capturing way more accurate business if we look at it this way or this way. And so I think this is a great area for innovation. If you're a potential founder, entrepreneur out there, to be thinking about what are these data models. The big question on Now Next Later, Taylor, that we deal with is what idea can you make accessible to lenders, right? The idea is fantastic. The working on it's great, but how does it become accessible? To your point earlier about which model we use, how do you get it in the bloodstream of the industry?
Yeah.
I promised we would watch the chat. Bob Nemi put in a question. I want to pose it to you, Taylor, since we did have it.
I saw the question. He's trying to back me into a corner.
Well, I think I was going to frame it. I like to kind of frame it in a way that I think, since you saw it, you can jump on it. But, I was just kind of thinking, does that change anything from a lender's perspective? Do you think that drives, in particular, Jonathan McKiernan has significant housing finance experience. So just your thoughts on maybe what that change would drive or what you're hearing from him and Calabria on what that outlook would be for Treasury versus FHFA.
So I would be lying if I told you that I had some inside baseball access to know everybody's thinking. I could take some wild guesses. I mean, monumental change has taken place at the CFPB between the time that McKiernan's, I said his name wrong, name was advanced versus now, right? So the chessboard has been fundamentally switched and shifted, and I would be willing to bet that that has something to do with it. I don't think it will ultimately make a difference because ultimately the director serves at the pleasure of the president. Thank you very much to the Supreme Court who made sure of that. SCOTUS came through and did the right thing and made the right decision, by the way. So the director serves at the pleasure of the president. If the president wants changes to be made, he is capable of initiating that through OMB, through the executive branch, through people like Mark Calabria, who will guide and direct the president's initiatives and philosophy. And clearly, this president is focused on enabling small and medium-sized business and large business, industry in general, in the United States to grow and thrive. That's where I see it going. And I see every single discussion about every single point and policy as focused on ensuring that business can thrive, because when businesses thrive, we are able to offer better options at a lower cost to put people into homes.
So that's in case I misquote Taylor, I'll say it generalized, and then you can keep me honest or not reply, and we can end the call. But I think in one of the meetings I heard, why wouldn't we bring someone back in who has extensive experience and when some of the things that we did have in place originally may or may not still fit today, to help us evaluate what still makes sense, what doesn't, and how to move forward. That was I'll say, what I took away from the answer I heard when that question was posed while we were at the CHLA fly-in. So again, I don't want to misspeak on someone's behalf, but if you agree, that's how I saw it and heard it.
I'm very optimistic. I see a lot of moves going the right direction. I think a lot of it makes a lot of sense. It's never made sense to have, well, let me say it differently. Lenders are generally regulated by their primary regulator first. And if you think about a policing model, the FBI doesn't drive around giving people traffic tickets, right? They come in to investigate when the local police don't have the resources necessary to navigate a problem, or when something becomes a federal problem. And the same model should apply.
All right. Well, this has been great, Taylor. I would talk to you all day on this stuff, so we'll definitely have you back so we can talk more about it. So if I could summarize kind of the three big things you said, look, this industry for 20 years is used to change. There's been change and we've got it again and we're used to it. Don't take the removal of all of these regulatory barriers as a green light to do anything that you wouldn't normally do, because as a lender, 5 years from now, 4 years from now, in your state tomorrow, whenever, you may have that scrutiny. So keep doing what you're doing. Focus on what you've always done. That's one thing. Two, there will be some new ideas. There will be some new policies. They're clearing the deck. They're getting ready by removing some things so that they can then do what it is they want to do. And then third, that thing is to try to help you with clarity around, is there somebody being harmed here? And if not, what are the things we can do to drive business forward, particularly for the American homeowner, if we could see that. So I can see why you're optimistic after those kind of takeaways. So those were my three highlights from today's show. Well, thanks for being here. And
thank you for having me. I loved it.
Yeah. Oh, good. Glad to hear that, because we will definitely have you back. Sasha, great to see you as always. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good week, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We'll be back next Monday. Till then.